Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to welcome Seth Czarnecki, an English teacher and Writing Center director at Algonquin Regional High School in Massachusetts. Seth wrote an article last year titled Labor-Based Grading, a New Ethic for Writing Feedback that was published by the National Council of the Teachers of English. And that article has added to the ongoing discussion around what we as educators genuinely seek to accomplish with student writing instruction. Seth is here today to share his position and strategies on student writing assessment. Seth, I'd like to thank you for joining us and welcome you to the ERWC community.
Thank you. I'll share my screen now. Okay. Right. Okay, so before we get started, I wanted just to say, extend my gratitude for the ERWC for reaching out to me and allowing me to share my little bit of experience and knowledge about something that I care quite a bit about. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you all. Let's see, I wanted to just drop a link in the chat to a like a bit of a resource list for folks. There we'll have the anchor text that we're going to be referring back to, as well as some resources that I've developed for my classroom that people can borrow and use, as well as the works that are referenced here. So to begin, I want to begin this presentation in the same way that I begin all of my writing classes, which is to say writing into class. And so I have this anchor text here called Constellations. And what I'd like to do is just have folks read it along with me. And when you're ready, just do a little quick write in like a spare piece of paper or notebook that's nearby, and just reflect on what this piece makes you think about or imagine, and what questions that emerged as you read. So I'll read that now, and then we'll have a little bit of time to write. So this is Constellations. My sister and I sit on the damp sand of the beach. It's the summer, and we're on our annual Cape trip. We stayed up way too late, but it felt right. I look up at the night sky. Stars engulf the never-ending blackness. Nothing feels real anymore. We could sit like this for hours, me and her. Her soft voice encapsulated me like a warm hug as we talked about everything, yet nothing at all, for hours on end, as if we had no fears. And like the constellations of the night sky, we align. So if you could just take a minute and just think about, or even do a little bit of writing of your own about what this piece makes you think about or imagine, or questions that emerged as you read, that would be great. So I'll just give you about a minute and a half to just reflect now. So this is a text we will come back to for sure. But yeah, I'll just share a little bit about me. The most important thing about me is that I am Faye's dad and Alex's husband. My wife and I welcomed our little one into our family this August, and it has been a wild ride ever since. And so if I seem a little fatigued, you'll hopefully forgive me. Having a 4-month-old is a lot. But in my spare time, I am an English teacher and a writing center director at Algonquin Regional High School in Northborough, Massachusetts. And I've been there for 14 years, my entire career so far, and will likely be there to the bitter end. A little bit more about our school. So the district I'm coming from is an affluent suburb whose students are mostly white and pretty high performing. So I have some state statistics here in terms of racial demographics, income demographics, graduation rates, and our state MCAS scores. And you'll see that our school is significantly white, and the amount of low-income students is relatively low, particularly in regards to the communities that surround us. Over the 14 years that I've been at Northborough, Southborough Regional School District, our district has become more racially diverse, ethnically diverse, and socioeconomically diverse, if you could believe it, based on those data points. But it's just within a few percentage points here and there. And so our district continues to be largely white and affluent. And I mention this, of course, because my students inform my work, and their backgrounds and experiences impact all of my decisions, including the move towards labor-based grading. And I'll talk more about that later. I've titled this presentation, People Over Papers, Reestablishing Connection Through Labor-Based Grading. A lot has been written about labor-based grading, and what interests me is how labor-based grading impacts the work of the teacher and our engagement with our student writers. I want to first talk about the distraction of grades. Right. So today I'm going to pay special attention to the rhetorical situation. Obviously, this is where we find ourselves anytime we are engaged in the act of communication. Indeed, I find myself in a unique rhetorical situation right now. And to be honest, I'm experiencing a little bit of imposter syndrome. But for our talk today, I'm going to focus on a few elements of the rhetorical situation in particular. I'm going to focus on the experience of the writer, the relationship between the reader and the writer, as well as the relationship between the reader and their topic. And so this is the rhetorical situation as it looks under normal circumstances. And what I mean by normal circumstances is when we read for our own purposes. The rhetorical situation typically looks like this. So let's start on the writer side of things. The writer typically has deep knowledge and understanding of their material. Their motivation to write could be many, which could include, but is not limited to, wanting to communicate, to convince, to entertain, to get paid. And their writing and point of view is impacted by their unique context, their values, their beliefs, their experiences. And when we read for our own purposes, on the reader side of things, we opt into the reading. We choose it for one reason or another. We trust our writer to do their job, although we may agree or disagree with their line of argumentation. We may like or dislike their style or writerly choices, etc. And rarely do we have any connection or direct relationship with that writer, which allows us really the space we need in order to be moved, to be convinced by their argument, to be entertained by their work. And our motivation to read can be one of many. And our experience of that text is influenced by our respective context. And so as a result, we may or may not be knowledgeable about the topic that we're reading. And this rhetorical situation was, for the most part, the rhetorical situation under which you read the anchor text for the first time. obviously you're joining an academic webinar, and so that might have informed your engagement that um, with that vignette. But for the most part, you're coming at that text in a pure form. But take a moment now to consider how your experience of this vignette might have changed were you to be asked to grade it. And in my experience, the act of having to grade a piece of writing has really impacted my engagement with it. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like from my point of view. So to start, when we introduce the classroom and traditional grading systems into the context of both the reader and the writer, things, in my opinion, shift dramatically. So in this situation, the student writer is typically grappling with the material for the very first time and may not have full control of their insights, whereas the teacher reader is likely an expert in their field or of the content. The main motivation for a large portion of our student writers is to earn a grade. Now, I totally understand and have many and know many students who write passionately, who have a thirst for knowledge, but they are still operating within a grade granting system. And as such, the grade is typically the metric of highest value and the thing that most of our students are working to earn. And so what ends up happening is that we have then this hierarchical relationship between the teacher reader and the student writer. And so not only are we teachers the ones who are experts in our fields, but we are also the one who grants the grade, the thing that the students are working to earn. And so that imbues us with a lot of power. Now, both the teacher reader and the student writer are impacted by the power dynamics at play and the influence of grade, or at least that has been the case for me. We respond to these dynamics in some form or another. For students, this might look like writing for the teacher, shaping their style, or even their ideas to what they believe the teacher wants. I teach a course called Advanced Writing Seminar, which is the tutor training course for students who want to work in the writing center at my school. And we talk a lot about what the rhetorical situation looks like in an academic setting from the student standpoint. And my tutors are very candid with me when they say that sometimes they will really try to figure out not just what the teacher wants in terms of style, but what the teacher thinks, and will try to write toward what they think the teacher thinks, with the hope of the teacher maybe agreeing with their point of view and their grade benefiting from it. Further, students are likely or less likely to take intellectual risks or stylistic risks for fear of, being marked down. Now, as teachers, when we sit down because we have our expertise and because we have likely assigned some of the same assignments for many years or read the same books for many years and have our unique perspectives about it, when we sit down with a piece of writing that we have to grade, we often read with what Brannon and Knobloch called the ideal text, and feel emboldened to correct the choices made by the writer. So unlike the rhetorical situation, when we read things for our own pleasure or our own interest, where we trust the reader to do their job, in this situation, we don't necessarily trust the reader the writer to do their job, or to do it as well as we would have hoped. And so in this way, the relationship between the reader and the writer, one where the reader is open to being moved and convinced and entertained, is kind of broken. Or as Peter Elbow puts it powerfully in his book, Writing Without Teachers, we don't tend to treat student writing like real reading. And so we too, like our students, are distracted by the grade. As a result, our feedback, as a result, the grade becomes the focus of our feedback, just as the grade tends to become the focus of the student's motivation. And thus our attention is divided, with half of our mind focused on calculating a grade, shaping our feedback to that grade, and the other half kind of attending to the writer's project as we should. And as I had mentioned before, that teacher, reader, student writer relationship is now disconnected from the work. And as Elbow says, we don't treat the writing like real reading. And as such, in my opinion, the human element is lost. And so to kind of illustrate this point from my own experiences, I offer this example, and I understand that I might be at risk of putting too fine a point on this, but this to me really illustrates my experience prior to labor-based grading. And so you'll see that there is a lot that's pedagogically cringy looking at this, at least from my point of view. We got 4 forms of feedback. We have marginal feedback, summative feedback. We have this ambiguous stoplight thing that's going on with the rubric and subjective values placed on each component of the essay. So there's a lot that I take issue with that I did back in 2017 and for years before that. But what strikes me most about the feedback on this essay is that the feedback and the comments are really declarative and paternalistic. And they are all shaped in relationship to the grade. And in truth, my summative comments were really shaped around the rubric and the grade itself. And so in the process for me, as it used to be, was I'd read the piece, do the marginal feedback, work off the rubric, calculate a grade, and then shape my summative feedback around that, kind of justifying or explaining the grade that the student found. And this, to me, really illustrates Elbow's point that there's nothing about this engagement with the writer's work that treats it like real reading. And it was no fun for me then, but I never really knew how to fix that problem. And I just have one more slide to this effect. Here are a number of different rubrics that I experimented with over the year. There's a single point rubric. There's your traditional grid rubric with the exemplary, proficient, needs improvement, unsatisfactory. So my journey to labor-based grading has been a long and tortured one. I've always felt that my grading practices kind of undercut my values as an educator. What I value as an educator is learning and risk-taking and experimentation. But the traditional mode of grading, one which values my subjective view of writing over anything else, mostly disregards the habits that are associated with learning and growth, and just privileges the lucky few who enter my room writing in the way that I like. So just being conscious of the time here. So let's jump to labor-based grading, because that's what you all wanted to hear about. But I thought I do feel like it was important to give you some context about where I'm coming from and what my experience was as a teacher of writing who didn't really know what else to do other than to try to find the best way through traditional grading ecologies. So enter Asao Bianoy. His speech at the 2019 Four Cs conference was an absolute game changer for me as an educator. His address, if you haven't listened to it, I would encourage you to. It is a rich text, but in it he talks about what he calls white language supremacy. and how the perpetuation of white language norms plays a role in normalizing and privileging some ways of languaging and diminishes and marginalizes others. But what hit me so hard, and what might have ultimately blown up the writing program administrator's listserv, was his bluntness. And he says here, if you use a single standard to grade students' languaging, you engage in racism. You actively promote white language supremacy, which is the handmaiden to white bias in the world, the kind that kills Black men on the streets by the hands of police through profiling and good old-fashioned prejudice. This quote floored me, and also made total sense to me. Because I grew up as a white boy in a largely white school system, because I went to a school went to university, which valued white language norms, the barometer by which I subjectively judge my students' writing is through the white language standard. And not only does this tip the scales in favor of the largely white student population that I have in front of me every day, but it stigmatizes and devalues, literally in terms of points, the ways of languaging of many of my my non-white students. And this speech really made me have to consider that, well, if the way I grade could be racist, what other signals are my grading policies sending? And so Inouye's speech was the call to action I needed to make a radical change. I knew that there were problems with the traditional way we grade writing, but as Inouye says in his speech, finding fault ain't the point. Changes, revolution, reconciliation. So that brings me to his book. And so I feel a little bit like a fraud speaking about labor-based grading, because the whole model that I use comes from his book, Labor-Based Grading Contracts, Building Equity and Inclusion in Compassionate Writing Classroom. And so in his book, Inouye maps out both the reasoning for and application of labor-based grading contracts in the post-secondary classroom. This is a rich text for sure. And so this is an overly simplistic of his nuanced and provocative book. Also, full disclosure, he released a second edition around the same time my daughter was born, and I just haven't had a chance to read the second edition. So I really urge everybody to read it. I've provided a link in the resources in the resources document that I shared earlier in the chat to his book. It's free on the WAC clearinghouse. But in Inouye's system, labor-based grading works like this. The teacher outlines objective measures to quantify the labor required to earn a specific grade. So for Inouye, it's time spent on the task. The student can either meet these expectations to earn a B, do additional work to earn a higher grade, or fall short and earn a lower one. And so the grade is calculated by the work that's done, not necessarily the teacher's idiosyncratic and subjective view of quality. That doesn't mean that subjective views and feedback and coaching are not provided. They are just given separate from the grade. And so in this system, as Inouye notes, the calculus is quote, the calculus is simple. The more labor you do, the better your grade in the course will be, with no attention to quality of the writing turned in on the part of the teacher. But again, it should be said that the grade, it does not represent the quality, but there's still feedback that is given from the instructor, and instruction and coaching is just not tied to the grade. So Inouye argues for labor-based grading contracts in terms of equity and anti-racism. And not only do labor-based grading contracts promote equity, but in Inouye's estimation, they serve to build trust between the teacher and the student. They increase motivation, and they focus the writer on what's most important, which is the work of learning. So as I began to apply this approach, and I'll talk about specifically how I apply it in my classroom in a moment, but as I began to apply this approach to grading in my classroom, I found that my relationships to my students and their writing began to evolve, to shift towards something more authentic and meaningful, not just for my students, but for me as well. And so this is what it started to look like if I'm going to sort of continue this this visual model. So before I get into it, to be clear, grades still very much exist for me and for my students. I teach in a traditional public school, and for those of us in the public school system, we know that change is slow. And I'll likely always have to deal with giving grades. But in the labor-based model, they are no longer the red herring, which draws both the writer and the reader's attention away from what really matters, which is learning, which is appreciating the work of the student. And so as a teacher reader, I'm still obligated to read and comment on my students' writing. My age and my expertise, my position of authority does not dismantle the hierarchy which exists between the teacher and the writer. But the labor-based model makes that relationship much more authentic. Since the grade is not tied to, since the grade is tied to the labor, the objective measure that I've outlined to the students are in full control of the grade that they earn. They know from the moment that they submit the assignment on our learning management system, they know from that moment exactly the grade that they earned, and so do I. And most times, I'm able to input their grade before ever even reading their piece. This is novel, and I've been doing labor-based grading now for about 4 years, and it's still a little bit uncomfortable for me. But once it's done, I am open. I'm open to the writer's choices. I'm open to their voice. I'm open to their arguments, all of it. And I'm able to treat their writing more like real reading, to bring Professor Elbow back into the mix. And as Maya Wilton, in her amazing essay, again, that's in the works cited, as she puts it, I'm able to give my students the gift of human response, because my feedback is no longer shaped around the grade. It's all about the writer's project, the writer's work, what I'm gaining from it, what I'm experiencing, what coaching I have to provide to them. And on the student side, I find that students are more likely to take intellectual and stylistic risks in their writing, to break free from the 5-paragraph model they've been so conditioned on in middle school. And so my hope is that the shift toward labor-based grading places value on what will make them better writers, right? So following the 5-paragraph form that they've been taught as early as 4th grade will not necessarily make them better writers. Trying to figure out what I think I want them to say and how I want them to say it will not make them better writers. Spending time will. Putting in effort will make them better writers. Taking risks, revising rigorously, seeking out feedback from other writers and multiple audiences. All of that is incentivized by the labor-based grading system. And I think labor-based grading makes these writerly moves more likely. But just to be clear, I don't claim that this is a silver bullet or a salve for all that's wrong with grading. I could speak to some of the concerns if there's a little bit of time that I do have. But what I'm saying is that labor-based grading is a better grading model for teaching writing than just associating grades with our subjective views of quality. I feel that way for all the same ways that Inouye maps out in his book, but I also feel that way because it is a better experience for us as teachers if we're able to engage more authentically with our students' work. So here's our anchor text that I had mentioned or that we had been engaging with periodically. And so, you know, you could just take a look at the feedback that I provided to the students. So I should say this vignette is from a rough draft of a series of vignettes, which is the first assignment my freshman students have to complete in the semester. And I now use the National Writing Project's Bless Address Press heuristic in providing feedback. I also have my students use that heuristic when they provide each other feedback. But my feedback here sounds more like me. It is based in suggestion and my experience. It's not resorting to the paternalistic, overly declarative, directive feedback that I had been giving for many years to my students because I felt obligated to justify the grade that I was giving them. So for me, this feedback that I provided to the student on his vignette rough drafts is more reflective of what I think I would say to a writer who I was just talking to about their writing and not necessarily worrying about calculating a grade. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about how labor-based grading looks like in practice. And this is where the resource list, right? So I shared this document with you all. This is where the resource list will come in handy. I'm going to talk about these 3 resources. So the sample assignment, which is the vignette series that I just referred to, we're going to look at that first. Then we'll take a look at the writing log, and then I'll talk about the course overview with the labor-based grading language. And so if you want to pull those up in your web browser and just have those available, I'll be talking through them here. So let's talk first, if we could, about the vignette series. So the content of this vignette series is pretty straightforward. I really just wanted students to do some accessible forms of writing where I'm able to learn a little bit about their lives and about their experiences early on in the year. And so they were tasked with writing a series of vignettes, and we do a whole unit around it where we're reading and engaging with mentor texts, and we're engaged in a pretty rigorous writing process. And this is not just the assignment, but also the labor-based grading agreement that is embedded within it. So to begin, I think I'll just talk about like the final draft and the labor that is calculated toward the grade, and then go from there. So for this assignment, the labor looks like this. Students, in order to earn the default grade, which is a B, need to do the following. They need to write a vignette series that's comprised of at least 3 vignettes that total 750 words or more. And one of those vignettes has to be 100 words or fewer. So in terms of the amount of writing and the expectation around that, that's the first piece of the labor. But there's also labor in terms of time spent. And I calculated over the course of the whole writing process that students should account for approximately 300 minutes of time spent drafting, revising, engaged in peer workshop in order to sort of meet the expectations that I've outlined. If students meet the content requirements, so the 750 words, three vignettes, one totaling no more than 100 words, and they meet the 300 minutes, they are guaranteeing themselves a B. So they know exactly what they need to do in order to earn a B. Now, I teach an honors English class for my freshmen, and many of those students are talented writers who are very used to grades that are much higher than a B. And for students who want to earn higher than a B, they can complete what are called extra labor opportunities. Extra labor opportunities vary from assignment to assignment. But these are opportunities to incentivize students to move and act and behave like real writers. So this is not intended to quench the thirst for higher grades, though that might be the motivation for some. On my end, it's meant to incentivize things that are valuable. So writing more, seeking out authentic feedback from multiple audiences, revising, submitting work for publication, among others, depending on the assignment. So for this assignment, students had 4 extra labor opportunities. They could choose some, all, none, totally up to them. They make their own academic choices in this regard. So they could choose to write 2 additional vignettes that totaled 500 words or more. They could attend a session at our school's writing center. They could submit their 100-word vignette to the New York Times personal narrative contest. And then once they submit their graded draft, they could then revise their work, schedule a time to meet with me, get some additional feedback, and then revise 2 of their vignettes and submit those revised vignettes at a later date. So what this adds up to is an assignment that anybody can earn the highest possible grade, an A+. And for students who struggle with writing, who might have specific learning disabilities having to do with writing, to earn an A+ on a writing assignment may never have happened for them. And this model provides the equity needed so that all students have access to the highest grades, with no minimization of the amount of work that goes into writing, because writing is hard work, it is not easy. I know that's reflected in the ERWC's principles, and I highlighted that. Work is not easy and it is not simple, or excuse me, writing isn't. And I think the labor-based model honors that. If you scroll down a little bit further, you'll notice that there's some language about what will happen if you don't meet the labor grades, which you could kind of take a look at your own, but it sort of maps out, well, if you fall short on your time, or you fail to fill out your writing log, or you miss a step of the process, what the penalties are for that. And then I have the sort of process mapped out and the recommended time spent on each task. Those numbers are recommended based on just what I think might work, but ultimately the number needs to add up to 300 minutes. So that is the assignment. Now, let's take a look at the writing log. So I have a student sample for you that's been filled out. This is the same student who wrote the Constellations vignette. You'll see that there are a number of tabs at the bottom here, a place where they summarize the feedback that they received from me, a place where they summarize the feedback that they received and gave during their peer workshop. But for our purposes, we're going to spend just a little bit of time looking at the labor log. So this is something that I borrowed directly from Professor Noy and adapted a little bit. But ultimately, this is what I call clocking in and out of work. If this is a labor-based grading system that honors work and labor of learning, then we have to keep track of that learning. And I say to my students, this feels really tedious and administrative. I understand that, but this is the trade-off. To be fully in control of your grade and of your work, we need to do this. And so they are asked to, at each point of the writing process, to account for their time, to write a little bit of a reflection, and ultimately that time should shake out to 300 minutes or more for this particular assignment. Finally, I will say that in all of my course overviews, I include language about how grading works. So I include some quotes from Professor Noy and the justification around equity terms and why we value labor when it comes to learning. I have also this year dropped my own article into the mix so that students can kind of see where I'm coming from and how the labor-based grading process impacts me as a teacher. But I think it's really important to be completely candid with students and open about how grading works, and to have this conversation ongoing throughout the year, and to invite their feedback, to invite their perspectives in order to refine this process. And so that's really it, to be honest. It is both simple and complicated all at the same time, but that's teaching. And I guess I'll just spend the last few minutes. Here we go. Here's my contact information, my work email. I don't have social media, so there's no Instagram or TikToks to follow with me. But I would love to answer any questions that folks might have.
Seth, I just put one question in the chat from Shar.
Sure.
She asked, what is the relationship between performance-based grading and grading for equity, and is there one?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, it's in the chat.
Oh yeah, so it's in the chat.
Yeah. What is the relationship between performance-based grading and grading for equity?
So for me, I feel like grading in terms of equity is about trying to meet students where they are. And so I'm not familiar with the phrase performance-based grading. Does that refer to, is that the umbrella under which labor-based grading might live?
She actually, Char followed up and she said, sorry, I meant labor-based grading. So it's labor-based grading and grading for equity.
Yeah, so so this is something that is at the center of Inouye's book. But ultimately, grading for equity, in my view, is about meeting students where they are, and understanding where they're coming from and allowing our grading policies to be shaped around that. And so labor-based grading sets a achievable goal for most students, I would say, because that is time on task. Anybody can spend time on task. Now, I do know of one book that was written in response to Inouye's about how inequitable the time requirement is. I have not read that book, but I can see that point. But I will say that in my experience, especially if we're spending a lot of that time in class, that time is achievable for all students, and then we can deal with quality and challenge students to go a little bit further in my dialogue with students and in my feedback to them.
She had a second question, and it's in the chat as well. And it says, do you find that students are focused more on growth with labor-based grading, or do they just complete the work in a haphazard fashion?
Yeah, and this is a little bit of like where I have some concerns about labor-based grading. I would be naive to think that with the writing log and the accounting of time that students aren't fudging the numbers. I would be naive to think that students are just jumping through the hoops that I've mapped out for them in order to earn the highest grade possible. That was true of all the rubrics that I've experimented with over the years as well. What makes labor-based grading different and makes the focus on growth more likely is that I am separating my idiosyncratic and unique perspective of what is good writing from their grade. So students don't have to write for me. They can write for themselves. And so I think that invites more students to take on challenges, to push themselves further, to spend more time on their writing. But again, it is not a silver bullet. And surely there will just be the students who say, I see an A plus and I could achieve it, I'm just going to do everything I have to get the A plus, and growth is not a part of their thought process. And that's unfortunate, but
Yeah,
I do think that it makes it more likely.
but like you said, we've been having these, like way back in the day, fraternities had cabinets full of articles and essays, and students who wanted a certain grade would just grab one and copy it and just turn it in. So I don't know if a student wanting to put in the effort or not makes that much of a difference, because like you said, students who don't want to put in the effort are always going to find a way. But I find this to be like, this could be a real game changer. I haven't heard of this before, and I am completely intrigued. I think that it is very innovative, and I can see us doing like a mini module or even a 2-day workshop. Were you going there too, Deborah, in your head? Like, this can really be deep, because the equity issues around grading and what we're trying to do. I always talk about Vision 2060, and what would education look like in 2060? If you were designing it, would you have the education system we have right now? And grading has always been one of my bugaboos.
Yes.
I'll let Deborah talk, because I can tell that she has some exciting things to say as well.
In some ways, I have knots in my stomach, and in other ways, I'm going, ooh.
I know.
My first question was, should ERWC abandon the use of rubrics and modules and then try and instead implement or build in something where we start at least introducing teachers who are using the curriculum to this idea of labor-based grading. Then I went into, okay, so you started with vignettes. I'm assuming that in the course of them writing these vignettes, you did some genre training or they did some genre studying to know what a vignette should look like, what it should include, so that there are still some content guidelines that students must follow in the writing of these vignettes as they would in the writing of any particular genre. Would that be an accurate statement?
Absolutely. And so I forgot who had said it to me, but somebody had said it, or maybe I've read it somewhere, but it was put so concisely that grading is not teaching.
No.
And so I think it's important to kind of understand that, because all of the teaching that goes into the teaching of writing is not, there's no exception because we're doing one form of grading or the other. So in this unit and all of my units with my freshmen, we treat it like a genre study. We read mentor texts. We talk about conventions. We talk about what makes a vignette different from a poem. What makes an opinion or editorial different from a literary analysis, et cetera. And so the skills that are involved, and I see that there's a question about skills, the skills that are involved in any writing assignment are still taught, are still spoken to. There's still a place for rubrics. If you like rubrics, you can have a rubric and say, you know what, this is where your discussion of evidence kind of sat, because that's what we talked about with literary analysis, right? And so this is where I was kind of seeing this the skill executed well or not well or both. But the only difference is that the grade that the student earns is not tied to that subjective measure. Because again, effective use of evidence might look one way for one teacher and different from another. And so the students should still get your subjective point of view. They should still hear your authentic point of view. The only difference is that point of view is not tied to the grade.
That's incredible.
It is.
And there's another question in the chat. Can you see it, Z?
Have your student skills improved more with labor-based grading than with how you previously graded? Do you yourself think the skills have improved?
So that's really hard. Thank you for that question. That's a really hard question to answer for a couple of reasons. I started using labor-based grading in the fall of 2019. And I've continued to use labor-based grading all through COVID lockdowns and in the sort of not post-pandemic, but in the era that we're in now, whatever phase we're in now. And so to know whether the student skills have benefited, like particular skills like writing thesis statements, incorporating evidence, their syntax, their diction, that's really hard to say because I've seen many of my, like just the overall performance of my students really slip in the aftermath of the pandemic. But when it comes to the way we motivate writers to and learners to act, which is to be curious, to be open to feedback, to take intellectual risks, those moves I do think are incentivized by the labor-based model. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's really hard to know like if the skills have improved because I've actually just seen a sort of a backslide in terms of overall student skills since the pandemic.
Chris, do you have any comments or questions before it's 5:27?
Well, just a comment. I do find it very intriguing, and I've always been, my high school colleagues, because I teach writing at the college level, have always been jealous when I talk about withholding grades, minimizing grades, and stressing feedback and growth. And so this seems like kind of a practical way to get at that goal of providing good quality feedback without the necessity of that focus on the grade, which has always been so important in the past. So I'm really intrigued by it. I think it has great possibilities for our program here, and I'm hoping to explore this more down the road.
Yes, Seth. So look for a few emails from me because I think I'm going to need a little more information, and you've become my resident expert.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
I can't recommend enough for folks to read the work of Asao Bianoy.
Yes.
Find him on podcasts because this has been his passion for many years, and he can speak so much more eloquently, particularly about the equity piece, because that's where his research really lives. So I would encourage and implore everybody to read his work as well.
I'm going to ask Stephanie to order the book for me. Deborah, Chris, and Shar, if you would like a copy of the book as well, let me know and I'll have Stephanie.
Please.
Okay. Stephanie, can you order copies of the book for me, Shar? And Shar, can you send Stephanie your address and she can get it to you? Deborah, I think Stephanie has your address, but you can.
She should have it, but I'll send it to her again.
Okay.
And then Chris, I know she has your address. Shar, Stephanie, could you put your email in the chat so you can get Shar's address? And Seth, I cannot thank you enough. This has been really eye-opening for me because I have been an advocate for looking at the grading system that we have and how inequitable it is. And this is the first time I've ever heard of something that I see that has potential. And when I was an instructor, when I was faculty at Cal State San Marcos, and I taught in the literacy courses, I used to tell my student teachers, if you have to read everything the students write, they will never write enough to become good writers because you can't possibly read enough. Like the piano teacher can't possibly listen to everything you play because if the only time you play the piano is for the teacher, then you'll never become a piano player. And this is one of those ways where you can help students become better writers because you have to write by, say, become better without you having to actually read every word they write, because that seems to be a limiting piece on what teachers actually assign for writing. Well, Seth, I'll let you have the last word for anybody who watches, because I have some people who are going to need to watch this video. So I'll let you have the last word and then we'll let you go because it's 5:31. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate
again,
it.
I'm just so grateful to you you all for inviting me and allowing me to speak on this. Ultimately, my last word for folks is to say, experiment. Try something new, see how it feels, see how it fits, invite some discomfort. because discomfort is where growth lives.
Thank you so very
you
much.
so much.
This has been amazing. Thank
Been
you. I look forward to
absolutely
talking
amazing.
to you again.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, everyone. Enjoy your evening.
Okay,
You
thank you.
too. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Z.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Deb.